She was thrown out of her home, rejected by her family and society. All because of something she couldn't control. But 10 years later, life surprised her in such a shocking way that no one could have imagined. Imagine being judged, despised, and left behind just for being the mother of black triplets. A nightmare that this woman lived, through no fault of her own. She, a white woman married to a black man, saw her life turned upside down when, after giving birth to 3 black children, she was thrown out of her in-laws' house, rejected by her own family and almost abandoned by her husband. What happened next? Well, you need to hear her story. When Elisa gave birth to her triplets, she expected the joy that every mother feels when she sees her children for the first time. But for her, that joy was quickly eclipsed by something much darker. Her children, still wrapped in their blankets, were born with black skin, and this simple characteristic triggered a reaction she could never have imagined. Her happiness turned into a nightmare, a silent and profound nightmare that she had to face alone. Her family, who were supposed to be a support, a safety net, turned their backs on her. Her parents, who had always taught her the importance of family, refused to accept her children. They couldn't accept the fact that she, a white woman, had had black children. No matter that her husband was black, it didn't seem to make sense to them. For them, Elisa's babies represented shame. They wondered aloud, how did this happen? They couldn't see the beauty of the children. They only saw a mark of something that, for them, was unacceptable. And so, instead of offering love and support, Elisa's family rejected her. But the pain Elisa felt didn't stop there. When she went to her husband, the man with whom she had shared so many dreams and hopes, the man who had been her support for so long, she was surprised by more rejection. Her husband, instead of joining her in this difficult moment, looked at her with a coldness that Elisa had never expected. He didn't hug her, he didn't console her. Instead of welcoming his children with love, he also felt ashamed. He was ashamed of the way they looked. "Why don't they look like me?" he said, his voice failing as he tried to justify his feelings. Elisa's pain was multiplied 1,000-fold. She didn't know what to do, how to deal with the man who, until then, had been her rock, but who now seemed more like a stranger. He didn't want her children, he didn't want her. And without further explanation, he left her. She was then faced with a cruel reality. She was alone, with 3 children to look after, without the support of her family and without the support of her husband. Society, which seemed to judge her all the time, didn't make things any easier. The prejudice Elisa faced didn't just come from her family. She also felt the weight of other people's gazes. Most people didn't bother to find out the truth. They simply saw the white woman with black children and judged her. The racism she experienced so intensely made her question everything. Did I do something wrong? She thought, while looking after her children, who were still too young to understand what was happening. Elisa felt completely isolated. But the pain of being rejected by her family and society wasn't the worst of her challenges. The real weight Elisa carried was seeing the pain in her children's eyes. From their earliest days, the children felt the weight of others' contempt, even if they didn't fully understand why. They were too small to speak, but the looks in people's eyes, the whispers and the words thrown in their direction, were messages that they somehow managed to understand. Elisa felt as if she was being forced to carry not only her suffering, but theirs too. As a mother, she wanted to protect them from all this, but the barriers that society imposed were insurmountable. She found herself increasingly powerless, unable to defend her children from the cruel and insensitive world around them. Over the first few years, Elisa had to get used to the daily fear of being judged. She avoided leaving the house, fearing another look of contempt or rude words. She knew that no matter how strong she tried to be, no matter how deeply she loved her children, society would still see the triplets differently. They're just children, Elisa thought, but why does the world have to look at them like there's something wrong? The internal battle she fought every day exhausted her. Every visit to the supermarket, every trip to the park, meant a constant struggle to keep her head up. But deep down, Elisa knew that her children were precious and deserved everything she could give them. She knew that her love for them knew no bounds. At the same time, however, she felt overwhelmed. How to deal with prejudice without losing her sanity? How to raise her children in the best possible way when the world seemed to be against them? Elisa also had to fight the pain of not being able to provide her children with the security and stability she wanted. Without the support of her husband and family, she had to divide herself into 1,000 parts. She worked incessantly, in 2 jobs, to ensure that her children had the basics: food, clothes, education. There was no time to rest, no time for regrets. Every second of her day was a race against the clock, but she didn't give up. With every sacrifice she made, she felt a small sense of relief, as if she were gradually earning the right to live her own life again. And even on the hardest days, when tiredness seemed unbearable and tears overwhelmed her, Elisa got up. She knew that her children needed her, that somehow she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for them. Elisa's greatest fear, however, was not external rejection. Her greatest fear was failing as a mother. She feared that her children would grow up without understanding the value of who they were, without ever realizing how much they were loved and wanted. She feared that, when they faced society, they would feel that it was her fault, that they weren't enough, that they weren't worthy of love. She wanted to give them a better future, but she also knew that the pain of the past, the pain of rejection and abandonment, would be with them for a long time. But Elisa, with all the suffering she faced, never stopped fighting. She never allowed pain and prejudice to stop her from doing what was best for her children. The following years were a constant battle for Elisa. She tried in every way to create an environment where her children could grow up with confidence, despite the prejudice and difficulties. With every step she took, however, she felt the shadow of abandonment and rejection hanging over her. But something inside Elisa began to change, slowly, as she faced this struggle alone. She began to realize that the pain and weight of the past didn't have to define who she was or who her children would be in the future. Little by little, she began to grow stronger, as if each tear that fell was a symbol of resistance, not weakness. Every smile from her children, no matter how simple, gave her the strength to carry on. During this period, Elisa found unexpected support, a friend who changed her perspective on everything. He was a teacher at her children's school, a black man who, unlike most of the people around him, saw the triplets with the same love and affection as she did. He sought her out at one of the school meetings, where she was visibly tense, expecting yet another judgmental look from the other parents. Instead, he approached her with a genuine smile, something rare in Elisa's day. "I know what you're going through," he said, with a calm that Elisa couldn't understand at the time. "I grew up in a world where I was also rejected. But I've learned that, in the end, a mother's love and the strength of our identity are the greatest treasures we can offer our children." These words were a beacon in the darkness for Elisa. For the first time in a long time, she felt that someone really understood her pain, without judging her, without looking at her children differently. The friendship with this teacher was a turning point in Elisa's life. He began to help her not only with advice, but also with practical actions. He connected her with a support network of adoptive parents and families who, in some way, had also been marginalized by society. This support network became her second family. Elisa finally felt that she was not alone in this struggle. She didn't have to carry all the weight alone, and that relief was almost liberating. The triplets, seeing their mother calmer and less overwhelmed, also began to flourish. They began to excel at school, make friends, and show a confidence that Elisa had never imagined could exist in them. But, as everyone knows, life is rarely linear. Even with her support network and her children's growing confidence, Elisa still faced difficulties. Prejudice was still there, sometimes in more subtle ways, sometimes more aggressively. In one particular episode, Elisa was called a traitor at a parents' meeting because her children were getting more attention at school. She felt devastated, but instead of giving in to her anger, she chose silence. She looked at the teacher, who smiled again, as if to say, "This is your victory, Elisa. Now you can choose peace." It was a moment of personal growth for her. Elisa was no longer the woman who ran away from everything, who felt defeated. She was becoming a stronger mother, a woman who wouldn't allow anyone's negativity to destroy her love for her children. The life of Elisa and the triplets went on, with ups and downs, but each difficulty served as a lesson in resilience. Every time society tried to impose its limits on them, Elisa overcame them with an unwavering love that became the family's fortress. She began to understand that, although society was cruel, she had the power to shape her children's future in a way that no one could prevent. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she had control over the present and the future. Meanwhile, her children were beginning to excel in unexpected ways. At school, they were not only exemplary students, but also leaders. They began to fight against the stigma their parents carried and to use it as fuel for their own achievements. When Elisa looked at her children, she saw a reflection of her own strength, just as they saw hers. They were becoming incredible people, and Elisa knew that although the world was complicated and full of challenges, their strength as a family was unbreakable. However, the most remarkable turning point came when, at the age of 10, the triplets took part in an essay competition sponsored by a local organization. The theme was, "What it means to be different." Each of the triplets wrote about their own experiences of rejection and how their parents had always loved them unconditionally. On the day of the awards, as the triplets took to the stage to receive their prizes, the auditorium was silent. The words of Elisa's children touched the hearts of everyone present. The mother who had been rejected by society, her family and her own husband, now saw her children as examples of strength, resilience, and love. The triplets won first place, but the biggest prize wasn't the trophy. The biggest prize was the recognition that, despite everything they had faced, they were more than capable of thriving. It was at that moment, with the trophy in her hands and emotion running high, that Elisa finally understood the true meaning of the word overcoming. She had been through years of hardship, but looking at her children, she knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. She knew that the battle was not yet won, but she finally felt that she was in control of her destiny and the destiny of her children. She had become more than a mother. She had become an example of courage and resistance. And perhaps that was the greatest victory she could achieve. It was an ordinary afternoon when Elisa received an unexpected phone call, one of those calls that nobody expects but that changes everything. It was a call from a lawyer's office, and the word she heard next practically paralyzed her. "Mrs. Elisa, I have some information you'll want to hear, information about your family, about your children. I know that Mr. Marcos, your ex-husband, has something important to tell you." Elisa remained silent. For all those years, she had tried to forget everything that involved Marcos, but the mention of him immediately brought her back to the past. Memories of the insults, the cruel words and the pain he had caused began to swirl through her mind. That phone call came like a punch to the gut. What could Marcos want now? Why, after so many years, did he want to get in touch again? Elisa had many doubts, but the most important was the tone of the lawyer's voice, which seemed to know something she didn't, something that would make her question her entire reality. That same day, Elisa took her children and went to the lawyer's office, anxious but also full of fears. As she entered the room, she was greeted by a middle-aged man with a serious expression. Without beating about the bush, he explained the situation. "I have a letter from Marcos, your ex-husband. He was waiting for the right moment to tell you the truth, but now he thinks your children have a right to know." Elisa looked at the triplets next to her, feeling the weight of the conversation. They had heard enough to know that something was wrong, but they were still full of curiosity. With trembling hands, Elisa picked up the letter. What could it be? What could Marcos have kept for so long? She opened the letter and, as her eyes traveled over the written words, her heart began to beat faster. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but it certainly wasn't what she was reading. The letter was a confession. Marcos had finally opened up about what had happened years ago, when he had thrown her out of the house, claiming that the children were not his. He explained, with a tone of regret, that for a long time he had believed that the triplets were another man's children. He had allowed himself to believe something that was never true, a lie that he himself had fed. The truth was even more shocking. Marcos revealed that he had taken a paternity test shortly after Elisa's expulsion. However, what he didn't know was that, due to a technical error in the laboratory, the test results were completely distorted. Those children he had rejected, believing they weren't his, were in fact 100% his. The surprise came in the fact that he had been fooled by a simple mistake, and this had a devastating impact on his life, but even more so on the lives of Elisa and the children. "I never wanted to hurt you," Marcos wrote. "I regretted every day that I let you go, and then that I made every effort not to be part of my children's lives. But now I know the truth, and the only thing left for me to do is apologize. I understand if you never want to forgive me, Elisa, but I need my children to know that, somehow, I love them. I just hope that when they find out, they'll give me a chance to explain. I don't expect a reconciliation, but maybe one day they'll understand." Elisa's eyes were watery as she finished reading. Marcos's words made no sense to her. How could he have let something so important and fundamental be undone by such a simple mistake? What's more, how dare he now try to come back and somehow justify his abandonment? It didn't seem real. She felt a mixture of anger, pain, and a strange sense of relief. After all, everything was finally being cleared up, but why now? Why hadn't he cared when they needed him most? Why hadn't he done anything before? Elisa remained silent for a few moments, looking at her children, who were stunned by the revelation. They didn't speak, but the looks on their faces said it all. They were confused, hurt, and, in a way, disappointed. They had lived their entire lives without the presence of a father, and now, when the truth finally came out, it no longer seemed so important. What mattered was the fact that they had grown up without him, without his validation, without his love, and yet they had managed to achieve incredible things. And then, as Elisa tried to process the revelation and the conflicting feelings that arose in her chest, something incredible happened. One of the triplets, Lucas, who had always been the most reserved, the quietest about his feelings, looked at Elisa with a determined gaze. "Mom, I don't need anyone but you. We don't need Dad. All we ever wanted was your love and support. And that was more than enough to make us grow into strong, independent people." Those words broke Elisa's heart. She felt completely overwhelmed by a wave of emotions. Her son had just stated, clearly and forcefully, that the love she had always given them was the only thing that really mattered. And at that moment, Elisa realized something essential. The family she had created, with all its difficulties and struggles, was stronger than any bloodline. She had been the solid foundation her children needed, and they had learned to fight, to love, and to grow based on that unconditional love. The decision had been made. Elisa knew what she had to do. She looked at her children and, with tears in her eyes, smiled. There was no longer any place for Marcos in their lives. They were complete, stronger than ever. They were a family sustained by love, trust, and resilience. And now, more than ever, Elisa knew that she had fulfilled her mission, to give her children the strength to survive the world, regardless of who was by their side. Elisa was silent for a few minutes after Marcos's revelation, feeling the weight of the words, but also a sense of freedom she hadn't expected. She looked at her children, who were now calmer, but still with a mixture of confusion and anger in their eyes. They were processing the truth, the pain of a father who had been away for so long. But as she looked at their faces, Elisa realized something profound and liberating. Nothing, absolutely nothing, in the story they had lived up to that point had diminished the love and strength she had built with her children. They were a family. A family that had overcome challenges, rejections, and adversity. And, despite the weight of the past, they had become stronger than anyone could have imagined. Mark's letter, which somehow seemed to have provided an explanation for years of suffering, no longer had the power to change what was already done. What mattered was the present, the love she had for her children and the certainty that, despite the difficulties, she had never abandoned them. Elisa's love for the triplets had no logical explanation. It wasn't tied to a name, a surname, or a DNA test. It was pure and unconditional. And her children, over the years, had shown her that the true bond of a family goes far beyond blood. As Elisa hugged her children, with tears in her eyes, she finally understood that what she had built with them was a legacy that no one could erase. It didn't matter what Marcos had done wrong, or what words he was now trying to say. They were already complete. And at that moment, Elisa made a silent promise to herself. She would move on with her children, without looking back at the past. They had everything they needed, and the future was within their reach, stronger and brighter than ever. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching. And there's one more thing. He promised to marry her in kindergarten. Years later, fate intervened. That's the theme of the video I've embedded here. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.